Thank you for joining me again. This is the first of a 3-part mini-series focusing on the bus stop killer. Today I will be going through the background and relationship history of Levi Bellfield. Levi Bellfield was born in Isleworth, West London on the 17th of May 1968 to Joseph and Jean Roberts, née Bellfield. He had 3 older siblings, a brother, Richard, and 2 sisters, Lindy and Cheryl. He had Romany travellers' roots. His paternal uncle was of Brazil, one of the original gypsy families. They didn't believe they were confined to British laws and regulations. Levi's background was incredibly important to him, and he constantly aspired to win praise and affirmation from that side of his family. Levi's father died when he was just 10 to leukemia, and this was, unsurprisingly, a defining moment in the life of young Levi. Following the death of his father, Levi, his siblings and his mum lived on a council estate in southwest London. There was an extremely close bond between him and Jean. He was an absolute mother's boy. It was a close-knit family all round, but he especially was his mum's favourite. His mother was very protective of him and extremely overbearing. Reports suggest that they shared a bed, even later on in Bellfield's life whenever he came home to visit. And she apparently even wiped his bum for him up until his teens. If that's not an instance of overbearing behaviour, I don't know what is. In her eyes, Bellfield was perfect. He could do no wrong. He was a tearaway as a child, constantly getting into scrapes and scraps, etc. But this wasn't enough to colour his mum's view on him, and he remained the golden child throughout. When Bellfield was 12, he had a crush on a 14-year-old girl named Patsy Morris. Patsy was blonde and beautiful and completely out of the younger, then very awkward and skinny Bellfield's league. He got friend-zoned by Patsy. He appeared to just be grateful that they were just friends, but reports do say that he was disappointed by the situation. Patsy mysteriously disappeared in June 1980, and her body was sadly found 2 days later. She had been strangled to death. A month after Patsy was dead, somebody called the landline and threatened Patsy's parents. The person on the other end of the phone sounded like a teenage male. However, it was never proven that Bellfield was behind any of it, and he was never arrested for the crimes. In fact, nobody was ever arrested for them, and Patsy Morris's case is now a cold case. The popular consensus seems to be that Patsy rejected Bellfield's advances and he strangled her in a fit of rage, but this has never been proven. Regardless, Levi developed a hatred for blonde women as he grew older, and it is possible that Patsy was the catalyst to spark the horrifying series of crime which followed. As a teenager, he was obsessed with sex, and he would regularly make rude and offensive sexual comments towards girls he had staked out. He was already showing signs of being extremely obsessive and controlling towards any girlfriends he had, and this was all, unfortunately, as just a sign of things to come. By the time he was 13, he already had a criminal record for burglary, although plenty of other charges would be added on over the next few years. Bellfield left school with no formal qualifications. He began hitting up the gym in order to bulk up, as well as developing a large percentage of body fat. It gave him an impressively or intimidatingly wide stature set against his tall frame. He began picking up odd jobs for his friends, such as dealing drugs and enforcing, and this gave him a bit of cash here and there to get by. But of course, he was simply just perfecting his criminal ways at this point. And as his teens progressed, he found himself more and more regularly on the wrong side of the law. He had charges for several infractions, including car theft, failing to appear in court, benefit fraud, possession of an offensive weapon in public, credit card fraud, and driving offences. He believed he was above the law, just like some of his traveller kinship before him. In an effort to confuse the law and get away with more of his dodgy dealings, Bellfield began to use various aliases. He used at least 17, although there were possibly more, and he was known by a variety of names to a variety of people. Bellfield had various jobs throughout the years, but the one constant was his doorman work in various clubs around London. He loved being a doorman. It gave him the opportunity to exert authority over people, and it was a perfect place to meet girls, whether they were willing or not. At one point, Bellfield worked for a taxi company. However, he would also freelance as a self-employed driver on the side of his taxi job, and he had a small array of vehicles kitted out as sex wagons. These vehicles were sometimes bought, sometimes borrowed, and sometimes stolen. His priority really wasn't where to get the vehicles. It was just to ensure that constantly different ones would be harder to recognise. We'll come back to them later. They ended up playing a key part in the case against him. Now, Bellfield had a steady stream of relationships through the years. All of his relationships overlapped. There were numerous affairs and one-night stands throughout the period. It's safe to say that Bellfield thought of monogamy as a hypothetical concept, rather than an idealisation through which he should live. His relationship history is rather long-winded, but let's give it a go, just for shits and giggles. In 1989, 21-year-old Bellfield got together with his first long-time girlfriend, 17-year-old barmaid Becky Wilkinson. She was a struggling young single mum, working part-time as a barmaid to try and make ends meet, and she felt like her prayers had been answered when she first met the charismatic, cheeky, financially stable Levi Bellfield. They really weren't. Within a matter of weeks, Bellfield had impregnated Becky with their first child, Bobby Louise, before upping and leaving, getting himself into trouble, and coming back to her a few days later. In a nice round circle. After a couple of runs of this pattern, the violence began. The assaults got more and more frequent, and even though Bellfield wasn't even living with Becky and their children, she still found herself a prisoner in her own home. He was in and out of prison himself, and other women's beds, but managing to keep tabs on Becky throughout the lot. He kept her in line by way of threatening phone calls and letters, proving that he was aware of her every move. It wasn't until one evening in 1992 that Bellfield raped Becky at knife point. She decided that she'd had enough and contacted the police, but she later withdrew the statement. Upon which, Bellfield broke into her flat and raped her again to teach her a lesson. Stepping backwards slightly, soon after Becky gave birth to their second daughter, Levi had embarked on another relationship. This time with 21-year-old blonde, youthful Jo Collins. Jo said that he was always a fun and popular person to be around, the life of the party, and that possibly added to the pull of him. For the first few weeks he was Prince Charming, but once Jo fell pregnant, everything changed. He became a person that was entitled, women were meant to serve him, do what he wanted. If they didn't, he'd become nasty. He then moved on to torture and abuse, starting with the odd slap here and there and being lovely in between. He'd regularly punch his two girlfriends, bite them, kick them, burn them with cigarettes, and so on. He would spit at them, and he would follow them into the bathroom, sit on the edge of the bath, and watch them use the toilet, ensuring that privacy was just a thing of the past. And perhaps, even more disturbingly, he would make them, and subsequent partners, follow him into the bathroom so that they could wipe his ass for him, just like his mother reportedly did. During their relationship, Jo found a bag full of magazines belonging to Levi. All of the blonde models in the magazines had their faces stabbed and slashed. The bag also contained a balaclava and a knife, which Jo referred to as his rape kit. He flitted between the two women, beating and raping both of them. However, they weren't his only conquests, and he was still seeing other women as well, either for one-night stands or slightly longer flings. The two women, Becky and Jo, knew of each other. They had met each other, but each of them just wanted Bellfield's affection and approval, so both of the relationships continued in tandem. Jo went on to have 2 children with Bellfield. She became his common-law wife, while he was yo-yoing between them. Eventually, Bellfield's relationship with Becky dwindled. She was finally free of the physical presence of the man, but not free from the memories and emotional trauma which he had inflicted upon her and the 4 children they shared. Years later, Becky bravely gave testimony of the rapes and assaults to police. Bellfield didn't waste any time in getting into another long-term relationship to accompany Jo, because apparently monogamy's for schmucks. This time, it was with 17-year-old Emma Mills, and by the time Jo gave birth to their second child together, a little boy, Emma was already pregnant with Bellfield's child. Jo and Bellfield's relationship was fading away by this point, and they rarely saw each other. Bellfield was simply making visits to Jo to let her know that he had his eye on her and to talk to her about some of the more dubious of his activities. He enjoyed the look of repulsion she gave whenever he was able to shock her. However, this is by no means the last that we'll hear of Jo. Throughout all of this, Bellfield was working as a nightclub doorman, and he started having affairs with young girls he met through the clubs. He had ready access to several women, and with his charm, confidence, nice cars and clothes, combined with his position of authority, it was easy for him to attract women. He would work his charm on the younger-looking girls in the queue, using his charm, quick wit and authority to attract them, before passing out a card with his number on for the end of the night. For those that weren't attracted to him, there was always the trusty GHB. Gamma-hydroxybutyrate, or GHB, is a central nervous system depressive. It has several sedative and anaesthesic effects that it causes, so it's quite commonly used as a date rape drug, and that's exactly what Bellfield used it for. Some of the girls that he accosted were as young as 15, 16, and a couple were even younger than that. He even had the balls to invite one or two of his mates to join him from time to time. After all, it's not like the girls would remember the attack whilst they were drugged out of their eyeballs. The nightclubs weren't the only place where he picked up women, though. He'd already begun loitering in a lane that backed away from Joe's mum's house. He used to wait at the end of the lane, watching schoolgirls passing by, trying to get up the courage to grab one of them. He admitted to Joe on a few occasions that he had raped various girls and women, including a paraplegic woman who he physically lifted out of her wheelchair in order to rape. He used to tell Joe regularly how much he hated blonde women, how they were all slags, they deserved what they got. Joe later said that she wasn't sure whether to believe him or not, and she was too scared to report him even if it was true because of the regular beatings and sexual attacks she faced from him. She was also afraid of his family, to speak against as she showed disloyalty in the traveller community. Now, circling on back again, this time back to Emma. Emma came into Bellfield's life at a time when tensions were already running extremely high between all of his partners and ex-partners and children and his auntie's neighbour's cat and so on. And Emma's appearance just made things even worse. Her and Joe were constantly arguing and shouting at each other whenever they were close to one another. The first time that Bellfield attacked Emma was when she turned up to meet him, only to find him with Joe. Bellfield laid such an array of punches onto Emma that he worried she'd need medical attention, so he made Joe take Emma to the hospital, despite knowing how much the two women hated each other. It was just another way to exploit his power over all the women in his life. He was getting more bolshy with age. He even managed to convince the unwitting Emma to pass packages to his mates. She didn't realise exactly what was happening at the time, and it was only later that she realised the extent of her actions thanks to him. He was making her pass dangerous drugs to dangerous people. He later began dealing in firearms and bringing them into the house when their children was home. This absolutely terrified Emma, as you can imagine. I mean, guns and children in the same house, it's not a good mix, especially not when added with a violent, unpredictable monster of a man. Bellfield also repeated his previous habits of disappearing for days at a time on Emma as well. I mean, why break the habit of a lifetime? Emma eventually escaped Bellfield and moved her two children to a refuge, but after a while the time came for Emma to move on from the refuge and into a flat of her own. Bellfield used this opportunity to pounce. He began stalking Emma, obsessively watching her, phoning her, making sure that she knew he was watching her every move, just like he had done with Joe before. He cajoled and persuaded until eventually Emma gave in and gave Bellfield another chance. Of course, in true form, Bellfield had another woman on his side for all of this. A married woman on the verge of separation with 3 children. Mrs. Platt, I'll call her P. P was slightly older than his usual conquest. She was more mature, and she was simply looking for comfort at a time when her personal life appeared to be falling apart. Bellfield stayed informed of his behaviour through this relationship too, flitting between being caring and aggressive. However, with P, he was only verbally aggressive. It makes a change from the usual rapes and violence. And he started openly bringing lethal weapons and drugs into her car and home as well. On Monday the 15th of October 2001, 17-year-old blonde-haired Anna Maria Rennie went out for a walk after a row with her boyfriend. She was approached by a man who had exited a dark blue Mondeo. The man offered her a lift home and she declined. He then walked her over to his car, saying he wanted to show her something. Anna Maria noticed that there was a passenger in the car, although the passenger did and said absolutely nothing. The man who originally approached her then grabbed her, picked her up and attempted to physically put her in the car. There was a struggle and luckily Anna Maria escaped. She told the police a couple of days later. They were unable to find anybody with a dark blue